The genesis of this project goes back a long way. I really started to work on it when I was in college and graduate school because I found that most of the books recommended as the latest thing in sociology or economics or cultural history were written by authors who made fun of the Ten Commandments. And I kept a notebook of the attacks. And I got back to it when I retired in 1985. And I've spent about 10 years on this research because constantly I kept on finding more and more, and the book became bigger and bigger. The byproduct I would like people to know is first that there's been a concerted attack on the Ten Commandments by people that Paul Johnson calls the intellectuals. Many of these I've written about myself. Bertrand Russell and Sigmund Freud, the Marxists, and others, and that at first the defenses of the Ten Commandments I felt were rather weak, but they became strong when the full-fledged enemies of the Ten Commandments, namely the totalitarian dictators, showed that they had perverted forms of commandments. Then the defense of it became really strong. So I would like people to know that you can know the good of such a code as that of the Ten Commandments by finding out who the enemies are. What I say is that it's not only centuries old, it's millennia old. And I think as we approach the next millennium, that we should say it has more relevance now than we ever recognized before. And I think that relevance is because we live in a culture that is abandoning its rules, its regulations, abandoning its principles, and making everything a matter of personal preference, which becomes personal whim. And when you're confronted with that, then the strengths of the thou shalts and the thou shalt nots is more fully revealed than ever before.
October 1st, Pearl, Mississippi. A 16-year-old goes on a rampage and kills classmates. 7 are wounded. Before going to school that day, he had murdered his own mother. In the months that follow, other teens in schools in Kentucky and Oregon shoot and kill teachers and fellow students. 2 more parents are murdered by their own child. The child killed 2 and wounded 22 fellow students. All across the nation, violence by teenagers reaches epic proportions. January 11th, Washington, D.C. President Clinton admits adultery with Jennifer Flowers. National polls reflect Clinton's approval rates grow, exceeding 60%. The White House contends the president's sex life is no one's business. Polls show much of the public agrees. February 21st, 1994. Aldrich Ames, a 31-year veteran of the Central Intelligence Agency, is arrested for spying for the Soviet Union. Treason, leading to the execution of dozens of loyal U.S. agents overseas. Months later, even the FBI is forced to reveal one of its own agents has confessed to spying for Russia. All across America, the Daily News brings the stories. Drive-by shootings, drugs, and gang activity drives teen death rates higher and higher. In a suburb of Atlanta, a young couple is brutally murdered by 3 young carjackers. Investigations reveal at least one of the murderers had just been paroled for a previous violent offense after serving only a few months in prison. Sociologists, clergymen, and others probe events to detect the root causes. Within the nation's liberal establishment, many factors are suggested: abused or neglected childhoods, broken homes, alienation, and others. Predictably, the cry rises for more restrictions on the sale and ownership of firearms. With all this, the violence and lawlessness continues. Cocaine and marijuana sales soar. Most experts agree the nation faces a moral crisis, one in which the very fabric of society is under assault and being rent asunder. Many note the crisis arrives at a time when many mainline churches are struggling with moral issues and finding few answers. A prominent Episcopal bishop even authors a book assaulting many basic, deeply held traditional Christian tenets. The bishop even denies the divinity of Christ. Church leadership takes no action in response to the bishop's theory. The Episcopal Church suffers a huge loss of membership during recent decades. The emergency is not entirely limited to schools, the churches, or politics. The judiciary shares the guilt. A federal judge in New York outrageously frees a drug suspect even though police found a huge supply of illegal drugs in the trunk of her car, finding that the suspect was justified in being intimidated by the presence of police. Not only do political liberals continue to support lenient treatment of criminals, seeing crime as a result of society's failures rather than any failure on the part of the criminal, but their social theorizing increasingly promotes lowered educational standards, revisionist versions of history, and weakened family relationships. In short, much of America has lost any sort of moral compass through which to guide its life and personal conduct. All of this as a result of an ethical collapse in politics, education, media, society itself, and, most damaging, in the nation's judiciary. In Alabama, a district judge even rules against a state judge's display of the Ten Commandments in his courtroom, while another bars any religious reference whatever at school events. There can be little argument that these federal judges and others who have made similar rulings are technically correct and professionally safe in their rulings. They reflect, after all, a long record of such rulings by courts for several decades. They're all in line with the precedents. However, observers who are not shackled by the chains and restraints of a liberal-dominated judicial system can make compelling argument that the judge's rulings, while legally correct and compelling, are morally wrong and are perhaps a major contributing factor in the general moral decline in the nation.
The law, it seems, never considers the message the consistently anti-religious rulings communicate. There is simply no way of explaining to a 15-year-old, especially one without parental support, why Supreme Court rulings against prayer do not mean that prayer is a bad thing. It certainly suggests that prayer is not a good thing. The exact same message comes down when the Ten Commandments are barred from a courtroom. While lawyers can debate this issue, they cannot avoid the inescapable truth that such rulings form a basis for today's moral decline and crisis. In short, these rulings, while they serve the law in a technical sense, in effect betray mankind and its integrity. Accepting this premise, the liberal segment of the federal judiciary stands as an unindicted co-conspirator in cases of drive-by shootings, drug deals gone bad, and much of the violent crime that besets today's society. Liberal judges and the interpretation of the law to which they are beholden are responsible. Does this mean moving toward an American theocracy? Of course not. Freedom of religion is a foundational imperative for this country, but it can be cogently argued that freedom from religion is not such a mandate. There is an answer. It has existed for thousands of years in the form of the Decalogue, 10 plain rules of conduct handed down by an authority with far greater standing and credibility than any Supreme Court.
Here they are, the Ten Commandments, simple rules, immutable laws, God-given and in today's world too often violated or ignored by modern man. Today's headlines detail our problems across the nation. From Washington to Main Street, we face a crisis of morality. There is an answer. It is old, it is tried, it is true.
We now have meaningful research of those ancient laws of Moses and what they really mean and how they really work today. When put to practical use, that research can make a real difference in all society. The Executive Leadership Foundation intends to provide the resources necessary to publish this research, then make it available for practical application in families, businesses, and other key institutions of our society. It can make an honest difference. And your personal contribution to this special Executive Leadership Project will enable us to put this research into action, help generate a reversal of today's sad trend throughout our society, and through that application, help lead us all up the long path back to a more civilized country.
Given all this, conversation, books, and all the rest will not solve our problem. They can only provide a plan, a blueprint. If the problem is to be solved, it must be honestly confronted. Once confronted, it must be understood. Once understood, we will all realize the responsibility we all share in making this blueprint ours for our daily lives, for our families, and for our nation's future.